All right, so we'll start now. Okay. A very good afternoon to everyone present here. So we have guests from Caribbean countries, from London and from India as well. So it is one of its kind of webinar. So where we have guests from all over the world. Thank you so much everyone for joining. So I welcome you all for the webinar series which Legamvox has been again and again conducting in these tough times of COVID-19. I hope everyone is safe at whichever place they are right now. And so the topic for today's webinar is is opportunities for India and the Caribbean in a post-COVID world. And for today, we have two eminent speakers, Mr. Stephen Newton and Mr. Prashant Tehilani. So I'll give a brief introduction about both of them, and then we'll start with the webinar. So first of all, about Stephen Newton, who is a graduate of the American University Washington College of Law and is a current Chevening Scholar at Queen Mary University of London, pursuing a Masters of International Economic Law. His research focuses on international trade law, international tax law, and foreign investment law from a geopolitical perspective. Stephen has consulted for the United Nations Development Program. Thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invite, and it's actually an honor to have you with us. Now, for today, we have our second speaker, Mr. Prashant Tahilani. Prashant sir is a graduate of the National Law University Delhi, which is one of the most prominent law university in India, and is a LLM candidate in tax law at Queen Mary University of London. Before pursuing his master, Prashant sir has worked as a tax advisor and lawyer in India, specializing in corporate and international taxation, transfer pricing, indirect taxation, foreign trade, and investment. Indeed, he's a one of its personality, and for today, he's the one who would be able to do justice to the topic. I welcome both of our guests, and I request them to proceed with the webinar. And before that, I would request each one of our audience who are present here that if you have any doubts at any point of time, you can directly post it in the chat box, and accordingly, at the end of the session, 15 minutes we have reserved for question and answer. So we'll be going about that. We are live on Facebook as well. So if you have anyone who wants to join, they can join there as well. Thank you so much. Now over to Stephen, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. Okay, so well, I began to look at it from a geopolitical lens with the COVID response. And my responses to the question pose, what are opportunities? And I see opportunities lying in three main areas in the Caribbean. In our ITC center, as our overseas ITC center, in a response to companies who may want to exit China as a result of the COVID-19, and also companies who may want to remove operations from Hong Kong due to the new national securities legislation. And then I also saw opportunities in the Caribbean due to the strength of our new economic partnership agreement with the United Kingdom, and also the economic partnership agreement with the European Union. It's been around for a while, but we've never really leveraged it. And I think that's a good opportunity there. And then I've also saw the opportunity in terms of arbitration in the Caribbean, because Hong Kong may no longer have its status as an arbitration center. And I think the Caribbean is poised to pick up some business in international arbitration in that field, in a response to that. And then I also saw the opportunity in renewable energy. I think COVID has particularly shown us that when we emerge from COVID, we're going to have to emerge in a greener economy and a greener world. And disruptions. Suppose Barbados has disruptions to our oil supply due to another closed border situation where you can't physically move oil across borders, because that's how we source our all fossil fuels. That's something that is a piece that comes up to my mind. And I think also with our current environmental state and the need to switch to renewable energy, that this is something that we're going to have to accelerate at in a post-COVID world. So I'm going to start on arbitration. And arbitration, I think Barbados is poised to pick up working in arbitration for three reasons mainly: our geographical location, our legislative framework and our particular strength as well in tourism. And I think persons who would come to Barbados to do arbitration be really interested also in the tourist aspect. I see it as a form of legal tourism. So first, geographically. The region is a very attractive location to host arbitrations due to its natural geography at the crossroads of America and its mixture of legal regimes covering both common and civil law. That's the Caribbean region. In the Caribbean, we also have the British Virgin Islands and Jamaica who have the infrastructure to do arbitration as well. But specifically in Barbados, we have enacted unity trial model law through the International Arbitration Act. And a particular beauty of this is that the Act allows lawyers from jurisdictions other than Barbados to participate in international commercial arbitration. This is achieved by express discipline application of the Legal Professions Act, which usually precludes international lawyers from practicing Barbados. Another fact is that Barbados is a stable parliamentary democracy and member of the Commonwealth. And I think that similar aligns with Hong Kong's former position. And how Hong Kong now probably losing that position, Barbados may be poised to take advantage of that in gaining international commercial arbitration work. Additionally, Barbados has large conference facilities, and that'd be a great place to host international commercial arbitration. And then we have the hotel accommodations. Not to mention also that Barbados, we have an extremely sophisticated telecommunications center. So if you need to do digital arbitration as well, it can be conducted through that means. So that is what I see in terms of Barbados as a international commercial arbitration center. I just want to make sure I don't miss anything. Okay, and finally, international or commercial arbitration is known to be demanding and sometimes an exhausting activity. If any participants feel that they need to stay on in Barbados after a few days to rest and recuperate after arbitration session, the island is an island holiday paradise. And from that angle, I see Barbados being poised to pick up some international arbitration work. In terms of information communication technologies, Barbados has a very has a reliable telecommunications and infrastructure system, state-of-the-art technology, and a largely and highly skilled and educated population, and is service oriented. So we also have companies already there that contact center, customer and technical support centers, transaction processing, healthcare insurance claims processing, credit card applications, health information management, data entry and fulfillment, database management. I'm seeing that companies may want to headquarter their operations in Barbados. For example, a company such as Gildan has headquartered in Barbados and benefits from preferential tax rates in Barbados as well, but also that we have a population that can support data processing, order supplies, and also the various aspects of call center operations. And I think a lot of companies may want to move out of China after the post-COVID world, and we'll be poised to pick up some of that. Poised to pick up some of that activity. In terms of the economic partnership agreements, Barbados, we have an economic partnership agreement with the United Kingdom, which gives us a preferential tariff rate, and particularly in the advent of Brexit, that could be a really major advantage, because any good that's produced and manufactured in Barbados coming out and entering into the UK market benefits from that, compared to goods from the Eurozone, which we don't know what they'll be benefiting from yet, because their trade agreement hasn't been concluded as well. So that's really a major piece. But also Barbados has a number of, we have strong relationships with the European Union. We also have an economic partnership agreement with them. And currently, I know with the European Union and Brexit situation, there's instability there. It's going to affect trade. We don't know what's the situation right now. It's in a state of flux. So therefore, any good manufactured and produced in Barbados and exported to the European Union as well would have a preferential tax rate, tariff rate as well, and that's a benefit for producers, obviously, and for consumers. It makes it cheaper. So I see that as an excellent opportunity there as well. The main centerpiece, I would say, um, for Barbados is right now the incentive to invest in renewable energy. Barbados, we have a sole-owned energy operator, Barbados Light and Power, and it's never been diversified. We have a 98% reliance on fossil fuel energy. Barbados has targeted by 2030 to have a 30% renewable reliance on renewable energy. And therefore, we need to diversify the energy matrix. And for some reason, Barbados has put in place a large framework, legislative framework on tax incentives to invest in renewable energy. But a lot of persons, no company has taken up the move really. And I think that's a brilliant opportunity and a window to fill. And I'll just tell you some of the taxes. I can just briefly give you some of the tax incentives. There is a tax deduction of up to 10,000 Barbados dollars for home improvements on renewable energy. Also, any company who wishes to come to Barbados to set up renewable energy operations, they benefit from a tax holiday of 10 years. Any developer, manufacturer, or installer of renewable energy systems and energy efficient products. And also there's 150% deduction on interest on a loan in respect to the construction of a new or upgrading of an existing property to generate or supply or sell electricity. It's similar, 150% deduction for a period of 10 years commencing from income from the year 2012 of the amount expended on to train staff relating to generation and sale of energy. 150% the deduction on expenditure on marketing of products, and there's exemption. There's also the exemption of the payment of corporate income tax by a venture capital invested in renewable energy for a period of 10 years, and there's a deduction of contributions to a venture capital fund invested in renewable energy for energy efficient sectors for a period of 10 years as well. And there's also the exemption on dividends on terms of the dividends earned in shareholders in the renewable energy sector and on interest paid. So we have a really attractive tax system as well to encourage investment in renewable energy. And Barbados is the ideal spot for renewable energy because we have the supply of wind, we're coastal, we're island, we have water, the hydropower, and then there have been successful attempts at photovoltaic energy. And studies have shown that there's a large feasibility in the market for renewable energy uptake. It's just mostly that one of the major problems is that for the average Barbadian or Barbadian companies, the investors haven't moved towards renewable energy because of the high startup costs. But I'm thinking persons who have the capital to enter into the market or to partner with others, public or a public-private partnership with the government, could really be fill that void through renewable energy. And those are my basic thoughts right now on opportunities in Barbados. And I'll turn it over to Prashant, hear what he has to say, and then I'll chime back in.
Thank you, Steve. Steve, I just wanted to ask you something which I had this question for a very long time, and I think you would be able to address this. I mean, Caribbean countries have a very friendly, high net worth individual investor regime, right? So if you're a high net worth individual, and if you invest money into a particular country in the Caribbean, then you might get citizenship as well. So
Yes.
how does that regime work? Because it's a very controversial, it's been considered and perceived a very controversial regime in India because a lot of big businessmen have actually evaded Indian law enforcement and gone to the Caribbean countries with a view to get citizenship there. This is something, I mean, I would like you to address as well.
Okay, you're putting me on the spot. I haven't done a lot of research on that particular initiative. I know it's out there. I'm not sure the uptake in it. As you did say, those citizenship by investment, that's something that was marketed under the last administration. I don't know how well it was taken up, but a lot of Barbadians did have that similar concern that it would be used as a means of evasion authorities if you were on subject to international arrest warrant or something like that.
Yes.
It's a concern as well, but I know other countries like Antigua also
Yes, yes.
had the initiative. One of the persons who bought the initiative, this was in 2000, around 2008, was involved in a Ponzi scheme as
Yeah.
well. So it's something we are definitely aware of. I don't know how feasible it is to pursue that initiative right now. I'm not in this position to speak and say if it's a good initiative or a bad initiative, but I know it's out there. I know it's a concern that we've had around the initiative.
But you know, the fact that you have such a favorable corporate tax regime, along with the fact that if you are willing to invest in Barbados and it automatically gives you a right of a citizenship, then this makes the regime really favorable to anyone who's thinking of expanding overseas. And
Yes.
considering the fact that you have preferential trade arrangements as well with other countries.
Yes, yeah, it does. I forgot to mention there's a new initiative in Barbados just recently unveiled by Prime Minister Motley, who we are now issuing a 12-month stamp for persons who may want to relocate to Barbados to work remotely as well. So you can come to Barbados to work for 12 months, of any nationality, and that's something that had been done before. My only thought about it was it may have implications for your corporate tax structure if you do conduct activities and you don't become resident in that will meet the threshold of residence in Barbados. You may benefit from, you may on one hand benefit from our preferential corporate income tax rate. At the same time, you may, if you had to have a dispute, you may, where there's a dispute over the residency, dual residency, you may trigger something around that area. That's one initiative, but I think Barbados right now is in a period of flux and a period of transition as well, and we're now coming out with some of the new initiatives. Barbados is our tax system is developing. We've been approved by the OECD and the EU. We've been taken off the blacklist this year, but we've been grey listed. One of the things we do fall down on is our effective exchange of information. And I
Yes.
think that is something we're definitely going to have to do better on in terms of the international climate with the BEPS project as well. Also Barbados for manufacturing as well. We don't have transfer pricing legislation in place yet.
That's something which is very important. I mean, Ireland became so successful for a very long time because it didn't have transfer pricing legislation. And for manufacturing companies, if you don't have a legislation which actually ensures that your transfer prices are at an arm's length range, then that's a very good that's a very preferential tax regime for specifically for manufacturers.
Yes, yeah, it would be. I don't know how long that will last because Barbados will be under a lot of scrutiny by the European Union and the OECD as well. And I know Prime Minister Motley has announced her intentions to implement transfer pricing legislation. So far, I haven't seen anything rolled out yet. So for right now, that system remains in place, and I believe that if independent enterprises wanted to, if a subsidiary wanted to take advantage of that for while it's still in place, it could be taken advantage of. Our manufacturing center as well, we have manufacturing facilities, large industrial plants and industrial parks. We do have lots of manufacturing in global supply chains, inputs to technological components as well. So that's something that we could seize advantage of. We're also looking to break into more global supply chains as well, having more companies headquarter their manufacturing operations in Barbados as well. And it's a good, and again, our geographical location, it makes perfect sense. We have easy access to the Americas, easy access to the European Union, and then we're very closely bordered to Africa. I know we're talking about more transportation links between Africa, and that's a very key piece because Africa as an emerging market, and
Yes.
therefore if you have manufacturing operations in Barbados, you could also benefit from a preferential tax rate. You could also benefit from if you African companies send raw materials to Barbados and then we produce it in a group setting, and then it's exported to the European Union or exported to the UK. You benefit from the preferential tariff rate again in that situation. So that's another opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Steve. I'll now begin my part of the presentation. I'll basically first touch upon the impact of COVID-19, and then I'll talk about the sectors in which India has a lot to offer to the world in terms of opportunities after the coronavirus pandemic. And then I'll talk about the reforms which India needs to take. First, I'll talk about the impact of COVID-19 because it's something which all of us need to be addressed. Now, when you talk about the impact of COVID-19 on India, there are three major impacts. First, the pandemic has virtually halted the economy. Now, India's economy was already slowing down before this pandemic. And after this pandemic, what has happened is that the economy has virtually halted. Now, to kickstart that economy to pre-crisis levels is a big issue for the Indian government, and which every state government is facing in India. Now, the second major impact of the virus has been massive unemployment. If all of you would have seen videos of migrant workers walking on foot from one part of the country to another part of the country, right? That is only the tip of the iceberg. People are not taking into account the fact that there will be massive unemployment as a result of Indians being made redundant in the Middle East. You have a lot of Indians who work in the Middle East in sectors uh, where those jobs have virtually gone because those economies were dependent on oil, and because of the oil crash, uh, those workers have been completely affected. Imagine you have one member of the family who is the sole bread earner of the family, and his earnings have been completely stripped off as a result of the virus. So unemployment generated as a result of the virus in India, as well as Indians who are working abroad, this is the major impact of the virus. And to address this, I mean, you have to create employment. The state has to do it in collaboration with the private sector. Now, the third impact of the virus uh, has been the fact that there has been a disruption in our supply chains, which no one is actually talking about. Now, disruption in supply chains has an issue on inflation, on prices of vegetables which you purchase from the market. Now, till the time those supply chains are repaired, India might face a big spike in prices of basic commodities like fruits and vegetables. And this is something which many of us are not talking about, but it's going to be a major impact because food prices become political issues. And when they become political issues, then I mean, people get angry, and that anger is projected in elections and in other areas in society. Now, amidst all this, what opportunities does India have? I mean, if I am a potential foreign investor, I would like to invest in India, taking into account of three factors. The first factor is that we are we are self-reliant upon science and technology. We have a growing science and technology sector, which is very important. Now, after this pandemic, a lot of companies which will eventually survive will be those which are operating in the science and technology sector. So companies like Infosys, TCS, pharmaceutical companies like Cipla, they will obviously survive the virus, but other sectors which are in the hospitality sector, restaurants, bars, hotels, they will suffer a lot. So any foreign investor who is going to invest into India will take account of the fact that India has a very robust science and technology sphere in front of him. The second thing which will attract investors is the fact that you have 1.3 billion potential customers. So India's population is huge. Now, for any investor who wants to come into India, he will look into that population and say to himself that these are my potential customers, and these customers I would like to target. The third thing which is in favor of India is that we have uh, we have a constitution, and we have a society which is guided by the rule of law. Indian courts are very efficient. We have a very robust legal system. And I mean, in India, we only talk about the fact that, Indian courts take a lot of time in deciding cases. But we cannot ignore one thing is that our legal system has been doing very well compared to other government institutions. So these are the three things which any foreign investor will look into while investing into India. Now, what are the reforms which India needs to take? Now, I have broadly divided these reforms into two areas. The first set of reforms are the tax reforms. Now, when you talk about tax reforms, you have two two options in front of you. The first option is to go for tax cuts, which is something Steve mentioned about tax holidays, right? Now, in 2019, the Indian government came up with a beneficial rate of corporate income tax for for companies who wanted to set up domestic manufacturing in India, right? Even before that, we have experimented with tax cuts in the form of special economic zones and excise free zones. Special economic zones were set up to ensure that there is domestic manufacturing in India for exports. At the same time, excise free zones were set up by provincial governments in India to ensure that there is first employment, and secondly, there is domestic manufacturing in those particular states. Now, when you talk about tax cuts are the most convenient way of attracting foreign investment. It's the easiest way for any government, because the any particular government will not have to spend money on building infrastructure, which is critical for multinational enterprises which manufacture products, because they have to move that particular product from the factory to the ports. Now, when you give tax cuts, it is the most convenient way, because you won't have to build that infrastructure. That infrastructure doesn't come into existence because of tax cuts. So there is an overwhelming view that these tax cuts are something which do not benefit the economy overall, and therefore they lead to a loss of tax revenues, and accordingly this is something which any government shouldn't do. And this has been demonstrated by the coronavirus. You see a lot of developed countries, like specifically I'll take the example of the UK, who've basically gone ahead and subsidized wages for workers who are working in different sectors. Why do you think India couldn't come up with such a plan? India couldn't come up with such a plan because our tax revenues have completely depleted in the past 3 to 4 years, and that has happened because we have gone with this idea that, if we go with tax cuts, we are going to attract the world's most leading manufacturing companies. So you have ended up in a situation where there has been a loss of tax revenues, and at the same time, because of this crisis, you cannot support households and businesses. So, taking cue from this, I recommend that India should go for a normal tax system. Now, in such a tax system, the rate of corporate income tax for companies who want to invest into India and which are predominantly manufacturing based shouldn't be neither high nor too low. It should be at a normal rate, but such a tax system should be guided by the principle of certainty. What I mean by this is that we shouldn't be enacting retrospective tax legislations. And India is a country which has made a name for itself in this area. We enact so many retrospective taxes which basically disturb foreign investors, and and that basically kills foreign investment sentiment. No foreign investor is going to invest into a country and be faced with the possibility that after 10 years, that government is going to slap him with a retrospective tax levy. Now, this is something which we need to work upon. It is going to be a difficult issue because, I mean, in India's context, companies pay the highest amount of taxes to the government. So a reform in those on those lines will be really beneficial for India to be a global manufacturing hub, because at the end of the day, investors want certainty. They want predictability in government policies, and predictability in government policies. One way of ensuring that is basically by ensuring that you give investors a stable tax system. If there is no stable tax system, no foreign investor is going to come and invest into India. Now, the third aspect of the reform in respect of taxes, which we should consider definitely, is that we should have amendments to the Indian Income Tax Act. Now, this is something which is a bit controversial, because in the Indian Income Tax Act, you don't have strict timelines for higher courts, specifically the High Courts and the Supreme Court, to decide cases. What I recommend is that there should be strict timelines for ensuring that cases are decided at these forums within strict time limits. Even though you have strict time limits for carrying out assessments, but at those particular levels, there are no time limits fixed for courts to decide cases. And that is a very big issue, because in India, tax cases particularly take years and years to get decided. Compared to a developed jurisdiction where a tax case might take 5 to 6 years, in India, it will take around 15 to 16 years. That is a big issue which needs to be addressed. And that is something which can be addressed because, like I mentioned before, India has a very good legal system. You have some very good judges who basically have good knowledge of tax regimes and how basically the Indian tax regime in interaction with the international tax environment works. So this is an area which can be reformed easily, and you just need to you just need to insert certain amendments into the Indian Income Tax Act, and you will be done. You will ensure that investors have the confidence in investing into India, and they know that if they invest into India and they have a tax dispute with the government, that dispute will be resolved within a short span of time. Now, when I talk about regulatory reforms, I'll be discussing 7 points which I think are very important for India to do right away. And this is something I read online, that India always legislates or takes out reforms in a crisis, which is true. I mean, this crisis is going to have a huge impact on our generation. I mean, if the government fails to generate employment for people, we might spiral into a situation where people are dissatisfied with the government, and there might be political and civil unrest in the country. So these 7 regulatory reforms touch upon different aspects. The first reform which should be carried out by the government is with respect to acquisition of land. Now, land acquisition has been a very controversial area of reform in India, because when the government wants to acquire a project for setting up a factory, then you have the involvement of politicians, and many times politicians, uh, basically to score brownie points, help in farmers to agitate. And when there is agitation of farmers, these initiatives for setting up factories, they virtually go away. So land acquisition is something which should be reformed immediately. And when I talk about land acquisition reform, I'm not saying that, industrialists should get lands at throwaway prices. You have to come out with a system where there is settlement of displaced communities. People who have been displaced from their lands, they should be given opportunities, and the government, I mean, can do this. I mean, we see in India, if there's a if someone who, I mean, if a police officer gets killed while discharging his official duties, the government comes out with schemes to help his family members by giving them employment. Why shouldn't the government not give employment to these people? I mean, to these displaced communities, so that they also have an opportunity to benefit from the setting up of an industry in their particular area. And when you talk about land acquisition, another thing which should be done is that land acquisition proceedings and the subsequent judicial review which takes place, there should be a strict time frame for those cases to be decided. You need to look at the roster of any particular high court and the Supreme Court for that matter, and see the number of cases which involve land acquisition. Those numbers are not inspiring at all, and those cases again take a lot of time. The second reform which should happen is with respect to labor laws. Now, after the coronavirus pandemic, you had UP, which is a province in India, which came out with a very unique labor law reform. The reform was that they completely scrapped the labor legislation for promoting industrialization. That is nothing but promotion of slavery. I mean, that is another form of promoting inhumane conditions of work. That is not a reform which we need. What we need is that there should be a consolidated labor law in India. And in India's constitutional framework, under the seventh schedule, labor law falls under the concurrent list. So the central government has the plenary power to legislate on these issues. We shouldn't be having, as we have in the current system, we have more than 20 labor law legislations governing, I mean, industries. You need a consolidated labor law, and that will help in ensuring that industries who are investing into India know that they are being bound by one set of legislation. 20 sets of legislation will create confusion in the minds of people. Now, the third reform, which I think is very central to India, is that there should be a reform of personal income tax and GST rates. This is something which successive governments have completely ignored. And why I think this is important is because you have to look back into history and see why did foreign investment come into India in the first place, and why did India grow at such high rates in the last 15 years. The thing was that any foreign investor, like I mentioned again, was coming into India with a large population in mind. And at the same time, when he was coming into India, he was also looking at a growing middle class, right? So, uh, personal income tax and GST reform will ensure that middle income families have more disposable income with them when they go out and spend money. And that is something which has been completely ignored. I mean, if you ask any person in India, if he is self-employed, if he is a chartered accountant, lawyer, or for that matter, a cost accountant, he will say that why should I pay my fair share of taxes to the government? His worry is that, I mean, I'll pay taxes to the government, but what will I get in return? And you look at the rate of GST which applies, the standard rate of GST is 18%. The effective tax rate is 36% because GST is levied at the central level as well as the state and union territory level. So you're paying on buying a particular commodity from the market, you're paying an effective tax rate of 36%. Any tax rate above 15%, in my opinion, is not good, because when you talk about GST, I mean, you have to take into account the fact that indirect taxes are regressive taxes. These taxes affect everyone. They affect the rich as well as the poor. And that is why you need to have a good and rational tax rate structure as far as GST is concerned. Now, when it comes to personal income tax, what I feel is important is that the government should realize that any person who is paying his fair share of taxes to the government has to be reciprocated. Reciprocation has to take place by ensuring that that person uh, I mean, gets social benefits from the government. In case that there is an issue of unemployment which that person faces, the government gives him an unemployment allowance. So reforms in personal income tax in these particular lines will be very helpful. The result will be that people will have more disposable income with them to spend on products and commodities. And this is something which India is currently facing, because businesses are facing an issue on the demand side, right? The supply side has no issue. There is an issue on the demand side because people are not going out and spending. And the reason behind that is that people don't have a lot of disposable income with them. And because of this pandemic, that issue has been aggravated, because people have a psychological fear of going out, that if they go out in the market they might contract the virus. So this is something which the government definitely needs to work upon. uh, the fourth and fifth area of reform, and this is something which Steve has very correctly pointed out in terms of Barbados's context, is that we need in India free trade agreements and investment treaties. And this is something which I mean, this government is not looking into seriously. The thing right now in India is that, and this is something which American policymakers also have, that we have an obsession with trade deficits. As a country, we only look into the fact that, we are exporting less but importing more from a particular country. And because of that, you have a trade deficit. I mean, Donald Trump has a big obsession with trade deficits, and that is why he's basically reworking the trade agreements which the US has with other countries. Now, what we fail to understand is that these trade agreements are very beneficial for countries. they help countries to form to be a part of supply chains. And there was a question which was posted on the chat box that, you have certain countries in Asia like Vietnam which are surging ahead. The reason why Vietnam is surging ahead is because they are open minded when they look into these issues, and they have just forged a free trade agreement with the European Union. And that is going to affect India, because we don't have free trade agreements with the EU or with the US. We have been negotiating our free trade agreement with the US since 2007. So more than 10 years have passed, but we have not signed any free trade agreement with India. So we need to look at these issues with an open mind, and take into account the fact that these preferential tariff regimes will help India to be a part of global supply chains. Uh, the fifth reform, like I mentioned, was regarding investment treaties. Over here as well, I mean, India has taken a very negative outlook on issues. It has terminated most of its investment treaties with other countries. The reason why it has terminated its investment treaties is because they think that the Indian government thinks that it's lopsided, right? But what they don't take into account the fact is that investment treaties work both ways. So if there is an Indian investor which is going to the UK and investing, he will also be given protection. And if you look into Indian industry, you will realize one thing for sure, that Indian entrepreneurs are very global minded. A lot of Indian companies are now investing across the globe. In the UK, at least, I mean, Tata is the largest employer in the UK. The reason why, I mean, these companies could invest overseas in the last decade was because India at that time had investment treaties with other countries. Now, if you're not entering into investment treaties, you're not only affecting foreign investment sentiment in India as well, but you're also affecting your domestic industries, which are capital exporting and which want to invest overseas. So this is an issue which needs to be reformed. We need to enter into more investment treaties with other countries. Now, the sixth and seventh area of reform, which I think is very crucial for India, is that there should be social reform. Why I say this is because, this is an area which many people don't like talking about, because it is a bit political. The thing is that any foreign investor who's seeking to invest into any country will look into the political climate of that country. Like Steve mentioned that Barbados has a stable political environment. India right now faces a big issue, is that we've enacted and taken actions in the past 1 year, which have been perceived as controversial by governments overseas, specifically the Citizenship Amendment Act. This is something which has put a very negative image of India abroad. That how come India is basically is changing its society. It's basically demographically changing certain areas. So this is something which India really needs to work upon. We need to build a very inclusive society. I mean, the past 1 month we've seen protests in the US and in Europe as a result of, I mean, the unfortunate death, and which was completely barbaric and horrible, of George Floyd. So George Floyd's death had basically sparked protests across the globe. And the perception was that, America has become a very unstable country, because of the way it's dealing with such issues. So India really needs to work in this area, that even if you want to take social reform, that social reform should not divide people at the end of the day in society. This is something which we really need to think about, because There are reports by the World Bank and the IMF which clearly show that any foreign investor who invests into a particular country, he will first look into the political environment and then invest. What is the point of investing into a country where there is social unrest and social division? So this is something which we really need to think about, and think about our priorities right now. The seventh area of reform, which I think is very crucial for India, is that we should promote an idea of private enterprise. The reason why I'm saying this is because I've seen that there is a tendency in India to associate a promotion of industry with crony capitalism. That if someone basically promotes a particular industry, he's basically a crony capitalist, and this has had a big impact on India. I mean, imagine how much of investment India has lost because of these acquisitions which are being made. Why I'm saying that you need to promote private enterprises, because the state cannot give employment to everyone. After COVID-19, there is going to be massive unemployment. To ensure that people are in gainful employment, you need to ensure that private enterprise, along with the state, also invests money in generating employment. So you need to do away with this culture of bashing corporates in India, which is something which needs to be looked at it very seriously. We need to promote a spirit of private enterprise. And why we need to do this is because India has a very vibrant startup culture. Some Indian startups are being talked about as the next Amazon, Google, or Facebook. Look at Ola. I mean, I Ola's journey in India and now overseas has been spectacular. Ola now has offices in London. It has offices in Australia, in New Zealand, and people think that it's a much better ride service than Uber. So if you don't promote this culture of promoting private enterprise, then you might ultimately affect the growing Indian startup culture, and you might affect domestic industries. So these are the reforms, the tax and regulatory reforms, which I think India needs to urgently take.
Thank you so much, sir, for such reforms. And I hope actually, like, if our participants are hearing this and more, we will be spreading this video everywhere. So let's hope actually such reforms comes in the country of Barbados as well as in India. So we have few questions, and one by one, shall we proceed with them?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Uh, so first question being from Mr. Sahej to Stephen, sir, that the entry of LAC countries into the global supply chain industry has created jobs, but these jobs are at lower stages of the value chain, which are more vulnerable to changes. When can we expect some employment generation higher up in the hierarchy with regard to the LAC countries? Stephen, sir.
Okay, you went for the big question. I don't have the answer to this, but we do recognize that yes, value chain. There's value chains create jobs, but there's the piece that the employment that is created a lot of times violate the affect your right to decent working conditions. Say Haj, is that what you're trying to raise the point on? That most of the times that a lot of the value chain creations that we're at the initial stages where persons are often a lot of the time for multinational corporations, they're paid less, they have less protections. Sometimes the industries are viewed as a bit exploitative, like a place in Cambodia, for example, or Vietnam, where you have a lot of garment manufacturing, and there's this whole thrust within global value chains with the clean clothes movement and those kind of movements that have a upgrading in conditions of work, security of work, better pay. Um, this is a problem at the bottom end of the value chain. I see the ILO has just put out a new report, and they focus on Nicaragua as well as a place with clothing production as well, and they're looking at the conditions of work, skill development, um, workers' rights. It's a problem. It's a problem that we've been highlighting over and over in the terms of globalization and value chains. I don't know particularly if there's a immediate answer to this problem. I would say in terms of from what I'm looking at, where I see in the ITCR headquarter and operations, that could create some more higher value work for persons in those kinds of operations that, you know, you'll be employing a lot more accounting professionals, persons who work on the daily IT skills, data inputs, legal professionals and staff in those kind of companies. That's a strictly value chain creation. But why do people like value chains? The whole point of the value chain is that a place you can produce a product cheaply, because it's more, the value they add is cheaper to source. That work is cheaper to source. But at that same time, you know, it trades off the workers' rights. I think one of the things that really would need to come into play there would be strong labor protection and domestic framework, but also under a bilateral investment treaty as well. Strong chapters on labor conditions and conditions on work, placing those on investors, investor obligations in there. Human rights as well. Prashant was alluding to it, that India needs to sign bilateral investment treaties. I know for sure that's something Barbados we're looking at right now. We have the investment treaties as well for foreign investors. We need to update them. They're the older model generation treaties, so they don't already have a lot of chapters on social protection, human rights, environment. That is something we really need to think about. So it's not like immediate answer as well. And the kind of value chains, manufacturing, persons on working on production lines, it has that inherent vulnerability of it, and that's a weakness of globalization. It's something I'm guarded against as we pursue value chains for job creation in Barbados. It's something we want employment, but we want quality employment. We want decent work. It's one of those trade-offs that comes oftentimes with the value chains. There was another question.
Yeah, there was one more question from Miss F. York. I am sorry if I am pronouncing it wrong. That what has the government put in place to ensure that any investment from foreign companies and individuals brings widespread benefit to the country as a whole and avoids wealth distribution just being limited to those who are already well off?
Oh, that's another puzzling one. Foreign companies. Mostly Barbados, one of the things we've pursued recently, instead of just lowering corporate taxation rates, is domestic tax rates, CIT. We've lowered those with the hopes that domestic investors will begin to employ more persons as well, and that profits will begin to trickle down. And that one of the pushes that Prime Minister Motley has really made is that historically, you know, wages in the Caribbean and in Barbados in these industries, they're on the lower side, and that with greater profits being earned, corporate social responsibility, that you have an obligation to pay better wages. I think one of the major keys in there is minimum wage legislation as well. That is the only way you're really going to, this is capitalism. The only way you're going to get persons to pay more and CEOs to design a company to pay more is if you mandate them to pay more through the form of minimum wage legislation or other legislation that prescribes wages. I think collective bargaining as well is in our social partnership is a very strong piece. We have a strong trade union movement as well. And I think, and we have a strong protection under international labor law and labor movements. So where persons do feel that they're being disadvantaged and their conditions of work aren't fair and their conditions of numerations aren't fair, there is the possibility to raise the issue, to agitate, to go on strike. You're going to have to leave those avenues open, and that's the only way really you're going to get any kind of change in that kind of system.
All right, sir.
And
Uh,
and Steve, I just wanted to ask this thing. I mean, in terms of labor law reform, I mean, it's been a very controversial area in India. I mean, labor law reform has been very difficult to pass. I mean, it's been very difficult to pass legislation. The thing is that I completely agree with you that that there should be a minimum wage for everyone. You should have a minimum wage as well as a universal basic income. But at the same time, in India's context, you have a lot of laws which don't allow companies to even close as well. I mean, you have a particular piece of legislation which basically ensures and requires that any private industry has to take permission from the government to close. So, how do you think that these issues should be addressed?
In labor law. Um, I'm getting some feedback. When you said a company has to take permission from the government to close, we don't have that sort of legislation in Barbados, and it's a hard thing to put that kind of obligation on a business. It's reality. If a business isn't making profits, it's going to have to close. You can't force them to be stay open to continue to pay employees. It's something we would like for sure. I think in that case, if a business is going to go to business, you have to ensure that you have strong labor law and legislation when it comes to severance payments, so persons can have predictability of severance payments, notice periods as well. So of intention to terminate labor are to be made redundant, and good best model practices and under ILO law in terms of making someone redundant or outsourcing jobs. You need to follow best international labor standard and labor practice. I'm not sure about the Indian context, but from what Prashant is highlighting, it seems that that is a problem there. If that is the case, I know these standards have been developed by the ILO. You need to really begin to enforce legislate them domestically and to have them enforced. And also another thing you need to do is to create the mechanisms to enforce employment law, which whether it be an employment law tribunal, employment a separate employment court. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, which has a large manufacturing industry, they have that. They put those kind of protections in place to ensure that labor rights aren't traded off in the pursuit of capital and investment. And also in bilateral investment treaties as well, you need to have provisions which have a non-lowering obligation in terms of labor standards, because as countries may want to attract FDI, they may be tempted to trade off labor rights and labor standards. You have to put that there, that an investor cannot derogate from labor standards, and that also you put it there that in seeking to attract investment, countries in the bilateral relationship will not lower labor standards.
all right. Prashant sir, we have few questions for you, and one of them is actually very interesting. We received from Facebook that when we are live on Facebook. So, sir, foreign players generally seem interested in inquiring existing assets, whether it is Paytm or the Flipkart Walmart deal or the Facebook investing in Geo. None of them seem to be interested in building something from scratch in terms of the typical greenfield investment. This greenfield investment in turn creates jobs and helps the economy. Why do you think these foreign investors are taking this kind of approach?
Because we have completely killed foreign investment sentiment, and that has been because of previous policies which have been adopted by governments. I mean, look at. I mean, I'm a tax practitioner. The way we have dealt with Vodafone, I mean, you don't need to go beyond Vodafone to understand how we have treated foreign investors. Vodafone is a telecom operator. When it entered into the Indian market, it invested heavily into India. It ensured that there were retail outlets opened in every possible city, which imagine the amount of unemployment, the amount of, sorry, employment Vodafone would have generated by opening those outlets at which people would go and buy their SIM cards. But what we did subsequently with Vodafone, we had an issue regarding capital gains tax. The treaty between India and Mauritius was very straight. It stated that, you know, if there was a gain which was arising as a result of disposal of an asset, and in that case shares were involved, that gain would be taxable in Mauritius, and Mauritius did not impose any capital gains tax. Vodafone won that dispute in the Supreme Court, but then we enacted a retrospective tax legislation, which was enacted from 1976. The reason why these greenfield investments are not happening in India is because we have treated foreign companies poorly in the past, and that is why they want to invest into these online digital businesses, because there the risks are low, right? There the risks are low. They don't run into these troubles with the government. Also, you also have to take into account the fact that operating or setting up a factory in India has been very problematic. I mean, land acquisition has been such a problematic area, which has never been, seriously looked into. I mean, imagine the POSCO plant which had to be set up in Odisha, in the Indian state of Odisha. POSCO is a big company, and ultimately they were hounded out of India. You look into how Tata was treated in West Bengal. Their land, they acquired the land, but subsequently the government said that, you know, the opposition said that you cannot acquire this land, and this led to them moving to Gujarat. So you need to change your basic policies, and that is why they are investing into these platforms like Paytm and Jio, is because there the risks are low. You don't have to set up big factories, or you don't have to set up or build infrastructure for which you need permits. I mean, you just need to invest into a digital platform. You need to take big office spaces on rent, and you can operate that business. So that is why greenfield investments are disappearing from India, and it's a very problematic thing, Simarjeet. This is not something which the government is willing to consider as well and talk about. I mean, the reason why India grew so much in the past 15 years was the fact that the government used to spend money, but now the government doesn't have the cash to spend that money in building that infrastructure. So you need to ensure that for greenfield investments to happen, you have to seriously take out these regulatory reforms.
All right, I understood, sir. Sir, going into the consideration of Make in India campaign, what do you think that India, has the Make in India campaign has actually turned out to be an effective thing or an alternative to the China-based manufactured good? So, how
I
well it has
pers-
come?
it's a very interesting question. I'll tell you something about the Make in India campaign. When I was working in India, I got a client query that whether, I mean, they wanted to know about the Make in India campaign. Now, when the Make in India campaign was launched, at that time there was no such beneficial corporate income tax rate which was introduced by the government. In fact, in 2015, when it was launched, the government wanted to lower the income tax for newly set up domestic industries, or for players who wanted to set up manufacturing in India at 15%, which was subsequently introduced in 2019. The government didn't take out reform at that time because of different political considerations, and that is where we missed out. Right now, the Make in India campaign has only been successful in the defense sector, right? Because India has a big army, And because of our geopolitical situation, we have to invest into our military as well. So that is why it was only restricted or limited to one particular sector, which was the defense sector. That is why, I mean, I believe it was not effective completely. But I think that after the coronavirus, if India takes these tax and regulatory reforms, we can definitely be a substitute for China or Vietnam. Imagine this: any potential foreign investor who is going to invest into India, he is not only going to produce for domestic consumers, but also for the overseas market. Because you have 1.3 billion people in India, that population is an asset, because that 1.3 billion people become your potential customers. And that is why it's a very good opportunity for India. But to move in that direction, you need reforms. And like I said, because of this issue of India facing a massive surge in unemployment, you might see a very desperate government taking out these reforms.
All right, sir. So there's one question from Mr. Sahej Mahajan that being a major source of the final demand market, this offers tremendous advantage in terms of agglomeration advantage, moving back and forth across borders, offering integrated facilities, low transportation cost, etc. Is this one of the reasons why there has not been any significant relocation of supply chains out of China?
The thing with China, I mean, the most important thing which we need to know about China is that it had a very low cost labor market. So, I mean, because of the fact that you have a different political system there, the government can really, it's easy for the government to legislate on those issues. And you also have to also take into account that it was not low cost transportation only. China has also built up infrastructure over the years. I mean, it has some of the biggest rail networks in the world, and which are much better than the ones in the European Union. I mean, people say that European Union has very good retail, has a very good rail network, but China's rail network is superb. And they have high speed trains which run at a much higher speed than the ones in Europe. So China didn't, I mean, the thing which favored China was not only the fact that they had low cost transportation systems or low cost labor, but they also invested in infrastructure. In our case, I mean, the reason why India has lagged behind is because, I mean, we couldn't spend money on infrastructure, because when you had to spend money on infrastructure by acquiring land, that land acquisition process became a big problem, because that land acquisition process was basically that issue was taken by politicians, and subsequently it was taken in courts. So for India to actually to go ahead, it needs to invest in infrastructure. And that is why I said tax cuts. Don't go with tax cuts. That would be a disastrous decision. Don't go with tax holidays or excise free zones or special economic zones, things which China did way back in the early 2000, right? What we need to do is that we need to have revenue as well. We need to have tax revenues to invest in these essential public services. And that is why to attract these companies, you need to invest in your public infrastructure, which is very essential. Because any factory which is producing a final product has to bring that product to the ports and subsequently ship it off to the overseas market. But for that to happen, you should have a robust public infrastructure system. And that is something which, I mean, this government is looking into it. And it's a very important thing that we also have seen a large opening up of new airports in small tier cities. It's a very good initiative. I mean, people might be criticizing it, but in the next 5 and 6 years, that will ensure that our economy grows more than 5 or 6% in the coming years. For that thing to happen, you have to continue spending. open new airports, build bridges, build highways, but at the same time carry out these fundamental tax and regulatory reforms.
Yeah, sorry. So I'll be asking one question each to both of you. That would be last for today. To Prashant sir, my question is that is the current public sentiment against Chinese manufactured goods here to will it be staying, or is it just a temporary issue? Can this end up making a difference in limiting India's dependence on China, or will it be just a temporary issue and it will be over once the COVID is done? So what are your views on that?
This is a very difficult question because it is obviously speculative. But I think that, boycotting Chinese products, I mean, can be problematic right now. Why I say this is because a lot of raw materials for our domestic industries or industries which are basically set up in India and they are exporting overseas, they source their raw materials from China, right? And an example of that would be in the pharmaceutical industry. The Indian pharmaceutical industry is in fact one of the most brilliant examples of how we have built up something from scratch. We couldn't manufacture medicines when we became independent in 1947, but we built up a very robust generic drug industry, and it was because of the fact that we had favorable patent policies which were adopted by successive governments. But for that industry right now, boycotting Chinese goods will be really problematic. And it will not be problematic for those industries, but for areas across the globe, because those industries are supplying drugs not only to Indian consumers but consumers overseas. For instance, HIV drugs, which are very essential for African countries, those are being produced in India and then subsequently exported to countries in Africa. And if you start boycotting Chinese goods, it will have a tremendous impact because prices will rise. So if a particular raw material is costing you 200 rupees from China, because you're looking for an alternative, and if that alternative does not have the capacity to make that raw material, then obviously that price would be either 300 or 400. So you're in a way ensuring by going towards this direction, you're ensuring that everyone suffers. So it might have a very drastic impact on certain industries in India, but I do agree that we need to diversify our economy as well. I mean, it's important that we move from a services-based economy to a manufacturing come services-based economy. And this is what this pandemic has shown. Countries which have been entirely dependent on tourism or on domestic or on consumption in restaurants, bars, and hotels, they have completely been wiped out. And and India has a very good opportunity to diversify its economy because we are a developing economy. We are not like the UK, which is a developed country, and and for us to basically manufacture on a global scale, on a large scale, might not be that difficult because of low labor costs. But for other countries which have tried doing that, I mean, the UK tried doing that after the 2008 2009 financial crisis. You had the former prime minister and the chancellor, David Cameron and George Osborne, who wanted to diversify the UK economy because 70% of that economy was dependent on services. And they realized because of that crash, that because banks had collapsed, and because of banks having collapsed, other institutions which were reliant on those banks had also collapsed. So they had tried to come up with this idea that let's diversify the British economy, and this is something which they're also trying to do after Brexit. They are going to ensure that the British economy gets diversified, but it's difficult for them because of costs being really high over here because it's a developed country. But for India, it's easier to diversify. And yes, if we take these reforms, we can produce not only for us, but for the entire world.
Um, for me, to chime in there, um, economic diversification is needed. Speaking from the context of the Caribbean, tourism has been decimated because of this. We can't continue to depend on it. I think economic diversification is good. We've shown that other countries need to begin bringing out a manufacturing industry because, well, China, we're so heavily reliant on China, where there's a situation like this where global supply chains, supplies are disrupted out of China. Every persons can't get the goods and services and products they need, and prices will rise. But boycotting China per se, let's look at China is good at what they do because they can manufacture and produce goods cheaply, and they can do that
Yes.
because of lower labor costs. You're going to need to find to boycott China. You're going to be able to need to have countries coming out that are able to manufacture products along similar quality and similar prices for this boycott to be feasible because prices will rise. Not to mention that right now it hurts the consumer, particularly a place like USA. USA right now has slapped China with tariffs causing Chinese products to rise. But Americans are big consumers of Chinese products as well. So if you
Yeah.
do that, tariffs as well, and then there's a boycott on Chinese goods, you're forcing more consumer choice has dwindled. Consumer choice has dwindled. And you have to be careful not to play internationalism because this is one thing we don't want to do as well, to make the world a smaller place, to limit options of what you can have. And basically, the American consumer would be forced to buy more American products or products from other parts of the world, European Union manufactured products. But the thing about it is, Americans really like because as the trade deficit shows,
Yeah.
Americans really like Chinese products.
Yes.
It's going to be a hard situation to say let's boycott but Chinese products because it comes down to pure economics of it. Can consumers afford the alternative? And is it sustainable to do so long term? If it becomes more expensive, inflation will rise. The point about it is, in simple consumption terms, consumers like to buy products that they like and they're familiar with, and they like to do so cheaply. And to boycott Chinese products, I just don't see it being feasible right now at this stage. I think eventually, as the global economy reorients itself and other countries come out as players in the manufacturing industry, persons can then begin to turn away from Chinese products because there's an alternative. And that's the first thing. We're going to have to supply an alternative for consumers as well, and an alternative that's similarly priced. And that's my take on it.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you. And with this, we come to the end of the webinar. Thank you so much, Stephen sir and Prashant sir, for your valuable time. Thank you so much that you accepted our proposal. We hope to host you in future as well. And I hope everything sorts out as quickly as possible. And this COVID-19, actually, there's a proper treatment for that. And then everything can come to the action again. Thank you so much, everyone.
Right.
That would be
Thank
all
you.
for today.
Bye.